It seems that we're live now. So first of all, let me welcome all the distinguished guests, ambassadors, government officials, civil society representatives to this session titled Catching Development, Acting Together for Sustainable Fisheries Trade. My name is Adam Wolfenden. I work for the Pacific Network on Globalization, which is a Pacific Islands-based nonprofit that focuses on self-determination and economic justice in the Pacific. So Pang is one of the co-sponsors of this session. The other sponsor is Handelskampanjen, who is a Norway-based civil society group that promotes trade, justice, and development, and says that lobbies to ensure that people and the communities are left to, and democratic bodies are the ones that decide what is best for those communities. So for people who, for this topic of the fisheries subsidies negotiations is something that has been going on for quite a long time in the WTO. The Sustainable Development Goals, bumped up that mandate and gave further impetus to these talks. And within these discussions, there's a whole range of issues that are coming up, and the distinguished panel that we have here will cover a lot of those and give quite a broad-ranging perspective on the talks and on the different sort of issues that are being confronted by, at the community level, as well as sort of the prospects for development. So for guests listening in here, it's first time using the WTO platform, there's opportunities for questions to, if something comes up, you have a question, put it in the little chat box that you should be able to see there through your portal. And then we'll do our best to get the speakers to discuss the topical issues that are being raised. So our first speaker is Margaret Nicardo. Margaret is the coordinator of the Katosi Women Development Trust in Uganda, as well as the executive director of the World Forum of Fish Harvesters and Fish Workers, which represents over 1 million small-scale fishers, processors, and workers. So Margaret, I'll hand the floor over to you to share your thoughts on this issue.
Thank you, Adam, for the introduction. Good morning to you all who are joining us. I'm joining you from the cool Kampala in Uganda, and I'm very happy to be part of this session. Our expectations as members of an international network for small-scale fisheries is that the outcome of the discussions on fisheries subsidies from the WTO shouldn't in any way undermine the capacities of small-scale fisheries and fishing communities in developing countries to develop their fishery through access to subsidies. The trade ministers should ensure that negotiations on fisheries subsidies target those most historically responsible for the state of global overfishing and not undermine the development aspiration of small-scale fisheries and fishing communities that represent 90% of the 120 million people involved in capture fisheries, and where over 90% of these small-scale fisher live in the developing countries. The current state of the negotiations about fisheries subsidies are threats to small-scale fishing as a model of food production, as a source of food, and its role to contribute to poverty eradication and as a way of living. Limiting subsidies to landing, packaging, processing, and distribution and other provisions such as fuel, gear at sea is not only disadvantage for the multifaceted nature of small-scale fisheries, where diversity of economic activities actually thrive from a fishing activity. It also excludes them from enjoying the benefits of shared investment and activities that drive most of the rural fisher economies. Developing countries don't have capacities in place to monitor all fishing in their waters. And failure to have such procedures in place could render the subsidy programs of their nations prone to be challenged by the foreign governments in WTO. Small-scale fishery in developing countries could be easily classified as unreported due to lack of capacities by developing countries to register all fishery. This presents a challenge for the developing countries to ensure that the regulations are in place so that it prevents them to being banned to provide subsidies. And whereas the 2-year transition that is being provided for in the negotiation is insufficient to implement such reforms. The requirement that countries cannot provide subsidy for fish stocks that are deemed to be overfished is also another disadvantage for small-scale fisheries, and particularly those in the developing countries. Whereas the discussions are still ongoing on who will get to determine which fish stock is overfished, in small-scale fishery that is characterized by multi-species fish, this is going to raise a lot of troubles which are going to be exacerbated by lack of capacities to clearly determine stock levels, and which should continue to be subsidized, placing developing countries and their small-scale fisheries again at disadvantages. And coastal fishing communities do not enjoy the same level of economic development as their counterparts in the developing countries. So supporting fishers is seen by the development governments as a means to contribute to the local development and to improve food security. Among the list of subsidies that aren't allowed related to overfishing and overcapacity include the construction of boats, fuel, ice income support. But these are again among the basic subsidies that small-scale fisher in developing countries require to be in position to develop their fishery. The proposition that big subsidizers can continue to subsidize their fleets as long as their stocks are sustainably managed and can fish in someone else's waters, provided the stock are well managed, takes us back to the reason why WFF was established in 1996, almost 20 years ago, which was to stop encroachment of small-scale fishing grounds by large industrial fishing fleets, which deprived small-scale fisher communities of fishery resources that they crucially depend on. Happening again when the countries are reducing and are removing import duties on fishery products under the regional free trade agreements, small-scale fisher will have to compete for markets with fish producers from big markets who may be subsidized. And this will again have devastating impact on the SSF that are from developing countries. These and many other threats arising from failure for developing countries to provide accurate data about the status quo of all the stocks, while the developed country able to provide accurate information of their fish stocks, hence allowing them to continue to subsidize their fishing fleets. The flexibilities that are dependent on fulfillment of requirements, including providing information, where many developing countries are struggling to provide information to the WTO, are limitations for countries that want to grow their domestic fishing capacity and where provision of subsidies are critical. At the time when contributions of fisheries to food security poverty eradication, and particularly small-scale fisheries is increasingly recognized globally, applying these WTO rules or recommendation will not only present a complete failure to meet SDG 1 to end poverty in all of its forms everywhere, SDG 2 to end hunger and achieve food security and improve the nutrition, SDG 8 to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, and lastly, SDG 14 to conserve sustainable use of the ocean, seas, and marine resources, but will also contradict the newly endorsed voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication that are coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization. The SSF guidelines, as they are called in abbreviations, are aimed at all actors striving to secure sustainable small-scale fisheries, to end hunger, poverty, and strengthen human rights. They are a tool to guide dialogue, policy processes, and action at all levels from all communities at the Global Forum. And at the time when we are talking about policy coherence and coordination, the outcome from the WTO negotiations should not in any way contradict the SSF guidelines, but should direct the governments and ensure secure and sustainable small-scale fisheries for the benefit of small-scale fish workers, and their communities. The outcome from the WTO negotiations should also complement the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries to achieve sustainable small-scale fishery through human rights-based approach, which calls for all forms of discrimination in the realization of rights must be prohibited, prevented, and eliminated. It also requires prioritization of those that are the most marginalized situations, who face the biggest barriers to realization of their rights, and those are the small-scale fisher communities. To end, we all know that fisheries are very marginalized. In my community, the people I work with and all the coastal fishing communities represent the marginalized sector in many of the countries. And according to the data from FAO, they are earning less than $1. And this is the new data emerging from the Eliminating the Hidden Harvest, which is currently again done by FAO. So it is important that developing countries have the provision to continue and are able to offer subsidies. I like to end by quoting the Friends of the Ocean Action. It says that the directive to WTO, it is a call to eliminate harmful subsidies. And not all subsidies are harmful. Subsidies for small-scale fisher and developing countries need to be protected by WTO so that developing countries have the opportunity to contribute to their development through fishery, secure people's rights to livelihood, food, and the right over their fisheries resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret, for that wonderful presentation and those really strong words, bringing the perspective of fisher folks to this conversation. You know, these are the communities who will really bear the impacts of any outcome in these negotiations. And I think especially highlighting that point around the different SDGs that will be undermined if these negotiations aren't done properly with development and sustainability at their core. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Professor Mukesh Bhatnagar. The professor is currently at the Center for WTO Studies in the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. Prior to this, he has spent over 30 years dealing with trade-related issues in the Department of Commerce in the government of India, as well as issues around export promotion, trade remedies, countervailing duty and safeguard duties. He's handled rules negotiations in the WTO Doha round and is currently actively involved in the fisheries subsidies negotiations. Professor Bhatnagar, I hand the floor to you.
Thank you, Adam, and very good morning or good afternoon to all the participants to this important session on catching development, acting together for sustainable fisheries trade. And I also welcome my fellow panelists, Margaret, Rashmi, Peter. I am going to talk briefly about the state of play on fisheries subsidies negotiations. And I have a short presentation, few slides, if these are visible now, Adam.
Yes, they are to me. They are to everyone else.
I hope it must be to all. So I'll try to present the state of play of the negotiations and key challenges being faced, and I think which will also address in some manner the issues which my fellow panelist Margaret raised in her address. And as we all know, we are now approaching to MC12 to be held on 30th November to 3rd December, very soon. And the negotiating group on rules is in the process of intense negotiations to finalize these negotiations, which were launched in 2001 under Doha round. And the mandate of MC11 is to conclude the negotiations by the next ministerial with effective disciplines for fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies which go for illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And while doing so, special and differential treatment for developing country members, including LDCs, has to be an integral part of the negotiations. That's the mandate. So we have the chair's text of 30th June 2021, which is the fourth version of the chair's text, which is currently the basis of negotiations. And there are three core pillars of the negotiations. Subsidies for IUU fishing have to be prohibited, and if the stocks are declared or recognized as overfished by the coastal member or RFMO, as per the legal text under negotiations, then the prohibition of overfish stocks can set in, subject to a member able to demonstrate that subsidies or measures are implemented to ensure that rebuilding of the stocks. Then in such situations, subsidies can be allowed to be continued. And then we have the third core discipline under negotiations, which is on overcapacity and overfishing, subsidies which contribute to overfishing and overfishing. And I'm going to dwell a bit longer on this pillar, because that is in a phase of intense negotiations. And as those who have been following the negotiations, there's a hybrid approach, seemingly gaining support with a list of subsidies, like subsidies for vessel construction, modernization, etc. Then operating cost subsidies and income support, and like there is a list from A to H in Article 5.1. And so, coupled with that, there is a flexibility, we can say, or an exception of a sustainability approach in 5.1.1. So if a subsidizing member is able to demonstrate that measures have been implemented to ensure the stocks in the relevant fishery at a sustainable level, then the subsidies can continue to be granted. So it's a hybrid approach and seemingly a compromise, because members have been negotiating this, whether there would have been a hard prohibition or based on fisheries management measures. So this is an approach which seemingly is gaining ground. And how effective a sustainability approach nobody knows. It has to be through a process of demonstration. A subsidizing member will be expected to demonstrate in the committee, or if the issues are not satisfactorily demonstrated, then a member can take the matter to a WTO dispute. Here it is important to mention that India very recently, last week, submitted a proposal which there has been mentioning that polluter pay principle, common but differentiated responsibility. And India proposed an approach that those members which were engaged in distant water fishing have to take more responsibility in these negotiations. And they should not be given the opportunity to give subsidies for fishing conducted by their operators or vessels when they fish beyond their own exclusive economic zone. The idea is that distant water fishing, which is supported by huge doles of subsidies, either through vessels, capital cost subsidies on vessels, or on operating costs like fuel, their subsidization has to be discouraged, and to be discouraged for certain years of time, which India has proposed and indicated 25 years, subject to negotiations. And that stems from the discourse which has been taking place lately, that common but differentiated responsibility should be reflected in the outcome of these negotiations. This has been a recent proposal which has also been, has a mixed response. Several members have felt that it is opening up a new issue at this stage and maybe creating divergences of views. But then what India has proposed has merits, in the sense that distant water fishing or large-scale industrial vessel fishing subsidies have to be curtailed. And then such members, if overcapacity and overfishing exists, which has been established in an RFMO fishing area, they should own up an obligation to reduce their fishing capacity, both in the RFMO area and where there is higher fishing capacity than required for fishing in high seas, which are other than RFMO area. There are also such members should take a responsibility to reduce their fishing capacity. This is a proposal which some can argue can be controversial, in the sense that fishing capacity reduction was not earlier being talked under the arena of WTO. But then when the members are embarking on sustainable fishing, that is one way of approaching, and I think it's worth talking about this. This is what India's position while introducing this proposal was. When it comes to special and differential treatment, and which is a core of these negotiations and integral part, the chair's text proposes Alt 2. Alt 1 was based on India's proposal, and Alt 2 is based on chair's proposal, which has 4 components: exemption for least developed countries, LDC members. Then for low income, resource poor and livelihood fishing up to 12 nautical miles. And then for fishing in exclusive economic zone or RFMO area, a transition period of 5 years. This is the chair's text, which according to the chair and also a group of members is a possible way of dealing on SNDT, though not liked by many developing countries, including India. And those developing countries who have small share in fish production, which is less than 0.7%, and subsidy below $25 billion, can come to the WTO committee to seek authorization beyond 5 years. So that is the SNDT being proposed in the chair's text. India's latest proposal talks of special and differential treatment, which has a common component of exemption for LDCs, exemption for low-income, resource poor, livelihood fishing, but it is up to EEZ. Unlike chair's text up to 12 nautical miles, what India has proposed is up to exclusive economic zone. A 25 years time for developing countries which are not engaged in distant water fishing, so they needed that much of policy space to grow their fisheries and also to catch up. So that is the time frame which India has proposed as a SNDT. It is a transition period. And then exemption for developing countries with less than 1% share in marine catch. This is a de minimis criteria which has been advocated by several countries, including the group of ACP countries, that those developing countries which have a smaller share in the global marine capture have to be given a policy space and they should not be subjected to discipline. Now, there is a third proposal on SNDT besides the chair's text, India's proposal and ACP group proposal, which was also submitted very recently, where the same component is there: exemption for LDCs, exemption for developing countries having a de minimis share in global marine catch in all geographic areas. So it is similar to what India is proposing. We have suggested an indicative 1% share in global marine capture, and the ACP and Africa group proposal also proposes a de minimis in a bracket to be negotiated. So there is commonality in the two approaches, which India is also suggesting, and so also ACP and Africa group. And then exemption for other developing countries who do not come under that 1% or the de minimis. They should have a flexibility to continue to enjoy exemption from the disciplines for fishing up to their exclusive economic zone. So these are the approaches for special and differential treatment, which are under negotiations and which are still having a divergence of positions in the group, in the sense that developed countries who are opposed to broader horizontal exceptions, carve-outs, or flexibilities are opposing a blanket SNDT for developing countries up to EZ. They are also suggesting for SNDT to be need-based, very narrow, or limited in time. The approach of India and ACP Africa group is asking for either EZ carve-out entirely, or in India's proposal for low-income resource poor up to EZ, plus policy space for another 25 years, subject to negotiations for other than low-income resource poor. And it's a challenge for negotiators to find the balance for special and differential treatment, having regard to the development needs of developing countries, preserving their right for policy space for their fisheries to grow. And nobody is talking that these fisheries will be conducted unsustainably. Members have in their own jurisdiction, their own fisheries conservation management measures, which they will be pursuing as per their national capabilities. But then the SNDT for developing countries is essential. So it cannot be denied or narrowed down to a very narrow time limit, or narrow to a very small description of kind of fishing activities like only artisanal and small scale fishing close to shore. Another important element of the negotiations which is unresolved is fuel subsidies, which is a very significant component of total global fishery subsidies. Some estimates say that these are about 22% of the global fisheries subsidies, and these are research estimates pointing to about $4 billion of fuel subsidies, though not much is being notified to the WTO for a variety of reasons, because in many cases the subsidy programs of fuel may be covered by broader energy or fuel programs which are horizontal in nature, and then members do not consider it to be notified to the WTO because these are not specific. But then fisheries do benefit in those jurisdictions. So what is being notified to the WTO, when Center for WTO Studies did some review of the members' notifications, they were only about 122 million worth of fuel subsidies being notified to the WTO, whereas the estimates of research institutions point to much higher, about 2 billion, 4 billion of fuel subsidies, but being administered in different forms. And if members say that we are going for sustainability of fish stocks, and if fuel subsidies are being administered in non-specific forms through horizontal programs in different administrations. This is a point worth considering, that what are we aiming to? If we are aiming at sustainability of fish stocks, then why non-specific fuel subsidies should not be subject to disciplines? That's a issue. Those who are opposed to it are having an argument that we have to be in the confine of the WTO subsidies agreement, which has specificity as the core of WTO subsidies agreement. But when this agreement is being negotiated, which is rooted in the sustainability plank, then and we are writing a new agreement of prohibited subsidies, a class of prohibited subsidies, then issue arises that why should you always look at the prism of specificity as enshrined in subsidies agreement, which it was in a trade context. And when we are writing a new agreement for sustainability, and knowing fully well that fuel accounts for a significant component, why to leave out non-specific fuel subsidies? So that's an issue which needs to be resolved, but it has not yet found a consensus.
Sorry, Mukesh, I'd just ask if you could wrap up, please.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So finally, this last slide, and relationship of the new disciplines with the international instruments. We have existing international instruments like UNCLOS, which recognize the sovereign rights of coastal state within their exclusive economic zone for exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing living resources. Whether there can be a scope exclusion for certain actions within a coastal state jurisdiction. That's an area, and it's ideas which have been floated in the NGR and which will be needing resolution. And finally, on dispute settlement, how the dispute settlement provisions of existing Article 4 of subsidies agreement or dispute settlement understanding of DSU will apply to the fisheries discipline, particularly on standard of review and the countermeasures which are envisaged under Article 4 of DSU. So these are some of the challenges, and I'll stop here, and thanks, Adam, and sorry for overshooting my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mukesh. It was it's always great to hear the perspective from people involved in the room and sort of some of the challenges that are being faced by the countries that are negotiating this text. So I'll hand quickly over to Peter Lunenborg. Peter is a senior program officer at the South Centre, which is a Geneva-based intergovernmental organization with 54 member countries. So Peter, I hand it over to you. Oh, you're on mute, Peter.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Can you all see the presentation? Can you
yep.
So I'm a senior program officer at the Trade for Development program at the South Centre, based here in Geneva. So we give policy advice, analysis, coalition building among developing countries on issues related to trade, and in particular the WTO. So that is, and among the active files is of course fishery subsidies. So what I will focus on here is to shed some light how the WTO fishery subsidies negotiations are building resilience for large-scale fisheries beyond COVID-19. This is actually the motto of the public forum, so I found it fitting as well to put it as a tagline on this PowerPoint. Just a few words on large-scale. Large-scale fisheries fish the most fish, around 75%. 70 to 75%, depending on your definition of large scale, is captured by large scale fisheries. They also get the most subsidies, around 84%, and in the case of fuel subsidies, it's even 90%. So basically, large scale fisheries gets the most fish, and they get the most subsidies. So it would make sense in any discipline that aims to add sustainability and that aims at eliminating subsidies to focus on large-scale fisheries. On top of that, large-scale fisheries has also a lot of other problems. It has lower socio-economic impacts and it's environmentally less sustainable. In terms of employment, you know, the employment multiplier is just less than small-scale fisheries. And if you look at environment, large-scale fisheries has more CO2 emissions, fuel consumption, more discard, more bycatch, and also more destruction of marine habitats. Of course, small scale can also have, but bottom trawling is at a scale that is much more immense than a few people throwing dynamite in the water. So overall, large scale is you know, it makes sense to focus any discipline on large scale fisheries. Now, this is the approach also taken in other international organizations like the International Maritime Organization. Many important instruments, many binding rules, for example, on NOx emissions, nitrogen oxide emissions, they actually only apply on large-scale vessels. The same about prevention of pollution by garbage from ships. And one of them is, of course, the abandoned fishing gear, which is actually one of the important elements in the big soup, you know, the garbage soup in the ocean. It only applies to big vessels. So that is the approach taken in other international organizations. So what is the approach taken in the WHO? The approach taken in the WHO is basically saying now all the rules apply to all vessels, all fisheries, but at the same time, it provides many flexibilities to large-scale fisheries. So here I cannot go in time to the details of that, but some provisions, various provisions in the text, the current JAS text, provide flexibility to large-scale fisheries. For instance, subsidies provided under access agreements are essentially excluded from coverage. Now, yeah, these access agreements, they are used by large-scale fisheries. So those subsidies to large-scale fisheries are excluded from prohibition, so they can continue. Subsidies to companies or people that lease vessel with commit IUU fishing may continue. This has to do with the definition of operator. An operator is defined as being the owner of a vessel or somebody who is actually on board the vessel. Now, industrial fishing, large-scale fishing, the mode of operation is that those vessels are often leased. I mean, it's the same as the airline industry, where many airline companies, they don't own their planes, they are leased. Container shipping is also, you know, we all know the Evergreen that was stranded in the Suez Canal. I mean, it had huge letters called Evergreen, but Evergreen is not the owner. It was some company in Hong Kong. So basically, through that device, subsidies, if you lease a vessel, and even if you commit, that vessel commits IUU fishing, illegal fishing, you can still provide subsidies to the company that leases the vessel. And that is usually the company that has the economic benefit. The determination of IUU fishing by a coastal state is not automatic. But subject to many procedural hubs. Now, IUU fishing is a scourge that generates many problems and is often caused by large-scale fishing. So the hope is that this fishery subsidies instrument would provide some tools to coastal members to do something about it. But the problem is that even if the coastal member has the resources to make a determination, it has a helicopter, it has speedboats, it has personnel to climb up a huge vessel and make a determination that actually has been IUU fishing, there are actually many conditionalities before such determination can be accepted as such. So in the end, we're not really sure whether subsidies will actually be prohibited. Professor Mukes also was talking about this. Non-Pacific subsidies are not covered. Now, this is very important in the case of fuel subsidies. Around 30 to 40% of all fishery subsidies are fuel subsidies. Now, many fuel subsidies in many jurisdictions are being provided not only to fishery vessels, but also, for example, to container vessels or to freight vessels. They are then called, they are not specific to the fishery sector. They are provided to a range of vessels. This is, for example, the case in the EU, which provide billions and billions in euros in fuel subsidy. This is not covered by this agreement, meaning that all these subsidies can continue if there is to be an outcome in MC12 and the 12 on fishery subsidies. Then we have a prohibition relating to fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But if you really look at the nitty-gritty of this provision, it is worded in a way it's really not clear when it is actually prohibited, because it says the mere fact that you actually fish in an area beyond national jurisdiction in the high seas doesn't mean that subsidies may be prohibited. They have to be contingent upon fishing in the high seas. But you know, in reality, large-scale vessels, they fish in EEZ and also in areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there is almost not any subsidy which is contingent upon fishing in a certain area, because the reality is that they do both. Then we have the so-called sustainability test, where that is really contingent. Basically, what it does is it's an escape clause. So we have subsidies which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. They are prohibited, but they might be okay under these conditions. So if the subsidizing member demonstrate that measures are implemented to maintain the stock or stocks in the relevant fishery or fisheries at a biological sustainable level. Now, just a few non-exhaustive notes about it. The measures, what are we actually talking about? If you kill dolphins to maintain certain fish stocks, actually that is a measure to maintain stocks in the relevant fishery. So there you go, that is fine. But actually we haven't met the sustainability of the marine environment. You only met the sustainability test maybe of that particular fish species. It says are implemented. So it is in the passive form. So the measures, which measures, who is supposed to implement those measures, right? It's not necessarily the subsidizing member. So the subsidizing member can rely on other members that ought to exist. There is also a footnote to this article on, you know, having more specific what it means biological sustainable level. If you read everything together, it basically means that you can continue your subsidization to this in water fishing if you implement measures for your fisheries in your own waters. Because biological sustainable level can only exist in waters that are under your own jurisdiction, meaning that for the high seas, there is no biological sustainable level. In general, this provision provides flexibility to countries that have the capacity to generate data and submit notifications to the WTO, in particular stock assessments. On top of that, examination of this notification can also lead to the development of fishery management norms at the WTO. So in conclusion, large-scale fisheries catch the most fish and receive the bulk of the subsidies. Current draft WTO instrument on fishery subsidies offers many flexibilities for large-scale fisheries, and as such, it builds resilience for large-scale fisheries beyond COVID-19. There is no guarantee that subsidies to large-scale fisheries will decline and might effectively keep such subsidies in place, especially subsidies provided by WTO members which have the capacity to provide information to the WTO. As a result, the sustainability objectives would not be achieved and developing countries would be curtailed in their policy space. So thank you. And if you have any questions, I'm here for you.
Great, thanks so much for that, Peter. I know I'm just cognizant of time, so I'll quickly pass the floor to Rashmi Hirkanti. Rashmi is the Executive Director of Indonesia for Global Justice. So Rashmi, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Adam, especially for the opportunity for us to share our concerns on the fishery subsidies negotiations. So yeah, Indonesia for Global Justice is based in Jakarta, and I'm joining from Jakarta. We, together with local fisher organizations and civil society organizations, has been following the process. So we also send letters many times to Indonesian government, especially to ensure the protections for small and traditional fishers. So I don't have PowerPoint, but I will try to make very short interventions. But in these sessions, especially I will try to bring the local perspective and voices from traditional and small-scale fishers related to the negotiations process. So yeah, I mean, fisheries actors in Indonesia are dominated by traditional fishers and small-scale fishers. So based on the data from the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, or KKP, more than 90% of the 2.2 million of all national fisheries actors are traditional fishers and small-scale fishers. However, the conditions of traditional fishers and small-scale fishers in Indonesia are facing serious challenges, such as the model of development, the climate crisis, including the natural disasters. So their vulnerability will be doubled if the negotiations of fisheries subsidies doesn't strengthen their positions as the main actor of food producers. So therefore, we have several concerns here in relations with the negotiations. First, the eliminations of subsidies in the WTO will threaten the small and traditional fishers. It's because small-scale fishers and traditional fishers still need subsidies from the state. So not only fuel subsidies, but also access to capital and market prices that really significant in helping their economy. So if the subsidy is removed, traditional fishers and small-scale fishers who use vessels under 10 gross tons, will be threatened because they cannot compete with large-scale fishing vessels. The data from Indonesian Traditional Fishers Union stated that 2.2 million fishers in Indonesia have contributed 25% of the national poverty rate. In fact, around 53% of families in coastal areas live below the poverty line. So even more, the Central Statistic Agencies in our country, or BPS, stated that the national average fishers exchange rate in 2019 stagnated at 113.74, and in 2020, it has decreased even more. So there is a subtle difference between an accepted index and a paid index, actually, which this means that the profits from fishing activities are very small compared to the cost that must be paid for fishing needs by the traditional and small-scale fishers. So these situations also related with the issues of unfair spatial and differential treatment rules that are part of our concerns. The exclusions of subsidies for developing countries, especially for small-scale and traditional fishers in Indonesia, which are limited to a certain period of time, since the agreement comes into force, will only make small and traditional fishers more vulnerable. For us, a flexibility with a certain time limit is not in accordance with the SDGs mandate, where the determinations of SNDT should be made permanent in recognitions of the asymmetry in development and resources between developed countries, developing countries, and least developed countries. So unfair spatial and differential treatment rules will potentially depriving rights of the traditional and small-scale fishers in Indonesia. We realized that the draft text of the WTO Fisheries Subsidies Agreement has deviated far from the mandate of Goal 14.6 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which aims to ensure the developing countries, including least developed countries and small island states, in maintaining the flexibility and ability of their countries to develop. In fact, I believe that previous speakers have mentioned about this, that the current draft text provides special and differential treatment in reverse to developed countries. So thus, with this regulatory model, developed countries will benefit greatly from this agreement because they are who are the most prepared to deal with sustainable fisheries management. On the other side, developing countries and least developed countries are still need more time to increase their management capacity. in the context of subsidies for the small scale and traditional fishers in developing countries, we put a lot of attention regarding the unfair SNDT rules in the text of negotiations that is related to the exclusions of the applications of subsidies for small and traditional fishers, which is limited to only 12 nautical miles. So Indonesia traditional fishers, especially, they don't catch fish uniformly in the territorial waters. The diversity of geographical realities, especially with archipelago character, sometimes allow small scales and traditional fishers to easily exceed 12 nautical miles of territorial waters. Various facts in the field have shown us that traditional fishers in Indonesia have been carrying out fishing activities from generations to generations since hundreds or even 1,000 years ago. For example, the traditional fishers on Wawoni Island, Konawa Island Regency in Southeast Sulawesi, most of them are doing fishing activities up to 400 to 1,400 miles from the shoreline of Wawoni Island. Usually they catch like skipjack or tuna in 3 locations such as West Papua, Nusa Tenggara water area, and in Natuna, which is really far from their island. So even more, in some cases, Indonesian small-scale and traditional fishers are facing unfair rules and competitions with big vessels who are fishing in the area below 5 miles. As one example is in Natuna and Masalembu fishing areas, where the large vessels carry out fishing activities below 12 miles and control the fishing area. In the end, the small and traditional fishers were displaced and had to find other fishing areas over 12 nautical miles. That is also the case why traditional and small-scale fishers cannot be limited, only have fishing activities below 12 nautical miles. Therefore, the provisions of subsidies for small-scale and traditional fishers doesn't need to be limited, both in terms of fishing area and certain period of time. They don't have any capacity to do overfishing or overcapacity with the existing fishing tools like vessels and their catching tools, including with the very limited resources, of course. Yeah. So our proposal is focusing subsidies for small-scale and traditional fishers in developing and least developed countries is a priority as the target group for the SNDT arrangements. So the text should also be clear, actually, about the qualifications of small-scale and traditional fishers, like character of the vessel capacity, fishing tools, and the traditions of fishing activities, etc. So it must be very clear. So as the final point, once again, we urge all the WTO member countries to prioritize the protections of traditional and small-scale fishers by applying spatial and differential treatment arrangement fairly for developing countries and least developed countries permanently without any time limits and territorial boundaries. I think that is my short intervention, Adam, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Rashmi. I'm very cognizant of time because there's a very hard limit at 7 p.m. It all shuts down. So for those people viewing remotely, you should be able to see the questions that have been, well, some of the questions that have been posted. I won't go through reading them out because all the speakers should also be able to see them in the chat box too. So maybe what I'll ask is I'll throw it back to the speakers to all just basically either, if you want to answer any of the questions, go for it. Or wrap up with any closing remarks, given the fact that we've only got 7 minutes left. So I'll stop talking. Mukesh, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, Adam, and thanks for the questions. I'll take the question number 3 first. How to address the fact that of the 12 of the top 15 fishing nations on global catch are developing? Yes, it is a fact well known. China, Indonesia, Peru, India may be also figuring 6. But there are two facts to be understood. The number of fishermen in these countries are large, and for their own domestic consumption they are catching more. But fish is also a very highly traded commodity. So the mere fact that amongst the developing countries are also the major producers should be a reason not to grant them SNDT is not a valid argument. The level of development of fisheries in many developing countries, as colleague from Indonesia just mentioned, the state of poor fishermen in these countries, number of poor fishermen, livelihood issues, these are very important. And so what is the parameter to know needs when you say need based, so developing countries are at different level of development, and the number of poor fishermen in countries. So whether you can adopt a per fisherman production, per fisherman subsidization, if you come to know, compare it with the developed countries, I think you will come find the numbers to be staggering, that developing countries have per capita production much lower than those of developed one. So it is difficult to straitjacket the special and differential treatment on need based. Some criteria will have to be adopted. India tried having 4 criteria in the previous in the chair's text, which is there 4 criteria, which did not gain traction, but that was an attempt to find some way of differentiation amongst the developing countries. If that is not the case, you will end up giving horizontal carve out up to exclusive economic zone, which members will have to ponder. Is this the way you would like to agree for a special differential treatment? And most of the developing countries will be needing a carve out, most of them. We know from ACP group countries, most of them need a permanent carve out, as we just heard from Rashmi, that SNDT cannot be time limited because of the status of those poor fishermen will remain the same. They are not going to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So you need a permanent carve out for them. And on the second question of some SND should not be on the basis of developing, but based on needs, I just explained, what is the needs, how a developing country can express or explain its needs. It has been explained whether the characterization of low income resource poor is a basis. It is there, but then many members say it should be a permanent scope carve out. Low income resource poor is a characterization of artisanal fishing. There has to be a permanent carve out, and that can be one. But then for a certain class of fishing activities, you need a permanent exception, like fishing close to shore or up to exclusive economic zone. And the livelihood issues will remain. So we do not want that the fishermen should always remain to be in a state of poverty. They have also a right to grow. I think I'll stop there. If question 1 is an attempt being made by several countries to target large-scale industrial fishing. India's recent proposal is aimed to have provision in respect of countries which engage in distant water fishing with the support of industrial fishing vessels. I'll stop here. I think others may also like to go.
Thanks, Mukesh. Peter or Rashmi, would you like to go next? Right, Peter.
So question 1, it does not. Question 2, that sounds reasonable. Question 3, question 2, there is a similar flexibility for small-scale farmers in agriculture, but it's much wider. Here we have something that is proposed to be geographically limited. I mean, that would be the same as saying, oh, okay, only farmers that live 22 kilometers from the capital can get subsidies or certain subsidies, and all the rest cannot. I mean, that doesn't make any sense to have a geographical limitation. And it is also time limited, which is not the case in agriculture. And then question 3, I think that has been addressed by Professor Mukesh. Thank you.
Great. Rashmi, would you like to wrap up? Any final comments?
Yeah, I think most of the questions have responded by Peter and Lucas. I just want to emphasize that for us, especially when we are thinking about the fishery subsidies negotiations, I think the most important thing is how we can still protect the small scale and traditional fishers. That is why in our work, actually, many times that we try to remind our government, for example, Indonesia, to put a lot of attentions how the government can still have policy space here to protect the small scale and traditional fishers. But if you see in the text, some limitations that we found for the small scale, even for the traditional fishers, it's still unfair for us because we also facing internal problems here. Because in Indonesia, we also have a problem in distributing the subsidies itself. But if once again the limitations, the SNDT limitations in the fisheries subsidies negotiations will create more impact to the small scales and traditional fishers in Indonesia, I think this will not be very fair for us. So that is why we put a lot of attention how these negotiations will not deprive the rights of small scales and traditional fishers. I think that's my last response.
Great, thank you so much for that, Rashmi. We're out of time now, so I'll have to wrap that up. Thank you once again to all the speakers. It was really fantastic, and to all the people who tuned in. So thank you very much, and we all will watch these negotiations very closely and hope that development is a core feature of it. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Peter, Rashmi, Margaret. Thank you.